This is the Analog Gamers Podcast with your hosts.
I'm Shane. And I'm Brent.
I'm Frank.
So we're talking about what we call gateway games today. The question there comes up, what is a gateway game? And we really think about that and how difficult the game is and what you've played before and after really moving into the board game arena. Often we have several games that we've played beforehand. Everyone's played some of these games as kids, I'm sure. The most popular probably being Monopoly or Sorry. Those kind of games that you play with your kids and kind of bring your kids up on. And then we have the more complicated games or more adult type games that we're considering gateway games that you start out with. Everyone started out with some of these games. Shane, what game did you start out with playing?
Yeah, so as I've said before, growing up, I played a lot of games, and they were mostly those kind of family games, the Monopoly, Chutes and Ladders, Scrabble, all that kind of stuff. And then the very first kind of more European style game I played was Settlers of Catan, and it was on a youth group mission trip, and one of my kids brought it, and he busted it out, and I sat there thinking like, man, this is my job. I'm getting paid to be here. I guess I have to play this game with these kids. So I sat down and we played, and I totally got my butt kicked, and I didn't really know what was going on, but I knew I loved it. The funny thing is probably about a month before I saw some guys playing it at like a men's retreat, and I was like, oh, those guys are so dumb. Look at them playing a board game. Joke's on me. No, I love board games and do a board game podcast. So for me, it was Settlers of Catan that really got me into the more European style gaming. What about you, Frank?
I mentioned this in the intro episode, but it was being at my brother's, and they pulled out Ticket to Ride, and I had never seen anything like it. You know, it's a kind of got a little bit of a feel of Rummy in it, which I played because it's got set collection in your hand. And I had not played anything like it, and that's where I looked it up on Wikipedia and found the link to Board Game Geek, and the rest is history. But so yeah, I mean, I grew up with Monopoly and Parcheesi and those, but quickly moved into Settlers of Catan kind of gateway games. So when we talk about gateways, we're talking about those games which are I almost like the term bridge game better because they bridge between what would be the games we had growing up and the hobby games. And they lay in that middle ground between that allows people to enter the hobby as far as they want. And they may decide to stay there and still have fun with people who, like us, are just as ready to pick the brain grinders.
I think, though, that there's definitely a point to be made for the more family-oriented games, the Trivial Pursuits and Monopolies that get pulled out at family gatherings, though, because they're the things that open people up to coming into the hobby at all. I mean, if you never played those with your family, sitting down with any board game would be intimidating, let alone with a board game like we generally like to play, or that even a simpler one than that, like Settlers of Catan, that you're looking at going, there's way too much going on here for me to play with.
Yeah, I think those games are definitely super important as a foundation, because I think you're right. Even just coming to a game and not understanding how like mechanics of a board game works, so not understanding roll the dice and how does that interact with the game, and what's the importance of randomization and card draw, which we'll talk about mechanics later. But I think you're absolutely right. It can be intimidating simply sitting down, and there are a lot of things to do in the game rather than just sitting and kind of being. So I agree. I think kind of those games you play growing up can form a really important foundation in order for you to play a gateway game like a Ticket to Ride or Settlers of Catan that can be intimidating if you have zero background in even what a board game looks like or how to sit down and play it, or kind of what the social contract is at the table of you don't flip the table over in the middle. Well,
if you're playing Monopoly.
I've done that, but sorry, Jenna, in Scrabble. Yeah, so I think that's really true, that it is really important, kind of those foundational games as well, to the gateway games that a lot of us play.
I think you're right. I mean, when you're talking about those kinds of foundational games, there are basic things that are necessary for children to learn in order to be able to play. You don't want to teach them on a game like Ticket to Ride or Settlers of Catan what it means to take your turn. and sit still while the next person is taking their turn, right? That's really more fitting for a Hasbro family game, right? Hasbro now has this family game night line, and it's all the stuff that we knew growing up. And those are great for teaching the social contract at the game table stuff. And I would not want to try and teach that and Ticket to Ride at the same time. So as we go forward and we've got foundational, it almost sounds like we've got foundational games, and we've got gateway games, and we've got moving further into the hobby, right? As we talk about those things, you're brand new to board gaming. You're kind of on your own. There's not somebody shepherding you into it, or maybe there's one person who's got some level of interest in it, but you're going to have a family game night. What do you pick? Now, let's assume your kids are teenagers so that you don't have to worry about teaching them to take turns and the social contract things.
So I think one of the most popular out there is Settlers of Catan. I think it's probably partially because it's available at Target. I think it just has a wide audience that people have played before, so that you usually have someone who at least has some familiarity with it.
Yeah, I think Settlers is a good one. We Ticket to Ride, obviously, as we've talked about. I think a co-op game like Pandemic can be really good too. So co-op games are where everybody's working together on the same team against the game, or a game like Forbidden Island, right? So instead of focusing necessarily on winners and losers in those games, you're kind of focusing on your experience together as a group. And so that way there's not the pressure to, do everything right. Because if, there's 3 players and you just absolutely suck, the person who almost won is like, well, you didn't help at all. So I think co-op games can be really good too from like a social standpoint to enter people into the hobby, just because there's not kind of the pressure on the individual to perform well, but rather being a part of the team that's trying to beat the game together.
I agree. And it's also good where you do have one younger child or one child who struggles with losing, is you get to model losing gracefully.
How many times are you that child, Frank?
Not very often. And we won't talk about that at the moment. But you've got this group of people who's playing, and the kid who struggles with losing now gets to see mom, dad, Uncle Frank, whatever the relationship is, but they get to see this adult person lose and kind of like, well, it was a game, and model that was fun, even though we lost. Try it again. Let's not get too upset. Let's focus on the fun we had, not on whether we won or lost. And they get to that kind of modeling. That's the best word I can think of.
So I have a unrelated question. Well, it's related, but unrelated to exactly this.
Who's going to win the Super Bowl? No.
So what do you think is more important, the game you pick as a gateway game or having a good teacher for the game? Because I've played new games that I think I would very easily categorize as gateway games, but even as a hobby gamer, I just don't get, because the person trying to teach it has no idea how to teach a game or what to do.
So interestingly enough, so as you were saying Pandemic, I was sitting here going, in the scenario I provided where there's not somebody guiding, I think Pandemic, if you're brand new to games and you're picking it up, that might be a tough one to follow, because there's so many new concepts in there. That's an action selection game, an action point game. You get 4 actions on your turn. That doesn't happen in Monopoly or Risk or any of the games that people might be more familiar with. So I'm not sure. At the same time, Forbidden Island, which is also co-op and also by the same designer, I think that's a great one, because I think the rules in there are simpler than they are in Pandemic. You look like Brent.
It makes me wonder whether, for someone who doesn't have a guide into this, whether they should pick up something closer to a Love Letter or a Sushi Go. With Love Letter, where there's not as many pieces, there's not as many bits for people to get overwhelmed with or confused on, and have to read rules on what does this piece do and why is this piece in there, but instead have all the rules written out, almost right on the pieces themselves for how those pieces are used. If you have a guide, I think that can be a good teacher. Then some of the other games work great, but when you don't have that guide, I think you might be right, and I think we almost should look at games that are almost self-contained within the pieces and aren't rule heavy for gateway games.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. There's a big difference between buying a game, going home, and trying to figure it out, than there is sitting down in a group where you have 2 or 3 people who have played it and are super familiar with it and trying to learn it that way. So like just last night, I had a few people over and we ended up bringing out Power Grid, which to me seems like a good gateway game, but I'm also, into the complicated games.
Is not a gateway game.
Well, but we had 2 people
Great
who,
game, not gateway.
we had 2 people who, if I said pick a game, they would pick Monopoly. And I think it was very helpful that I was able to sit down with them and just explain, here's steps 1, 2, 3, and 4 during your turn. And not just tell them, here's what you do, but to kind of help them make decisions throughout the game and to say, well, I see you making that decision, but consider these 2 options as well. And sometimes that means they make the original decision because it was the best one and I'm just trying to open them up. So I think it worked really well because we had 6 people playing, and out of those 6, 4 had played it a lot and were able to kind of help guide those 2, and they didn't come in last. So I almost think it's more important about who's teaching the game, whether it's self-taught, whether you have experienced players, than necessarily the game that you play. Now, obviously, there are games you don't want to throw brand new people into, but I think games
I would
like...
put Power Grid in that category.
Really?
Yeah, because here's the problem. The issue with complexity, in my mind, game complexity, is it's not that point at which people can't understand, it's that point at which people stop having fun and it starts feeling like work, right? And I think Power Grid, I think you run the risk of new gamers feeling like there's so much to consider that it's not enjoyable, it's work.
So you think it's about how many choices there are to make?
I do think it's about the decision tree. It's about the breadth of the decision tree, but it's also about how far deeply into the decision tree you have to think in order to make a good decision. I think if you have too many choices, or you have to be thinking about, in order to achieve this, I need to do these 5 things over my next 3 turns, it's going to be overwhelming, potentially. Not that they couldn't get there eventually, but it's not going to be fun. That first experience has to be fun.
Another mechanism that Power Grid has that I would almost take out of the gateway games is that it has multiple phases per turn. So it's not around the table, each person takes a turn, does something, or even around the table, each person can do 2 or 3 things, action selection type. It's a phased implementation of, I'm going into this phase of this turn and going to do this now. And then turn order changes and I'm going to go do a different phase now. But I haven't moved on to a new turn yet.
Yeah, and I think with those kinds of games too, it's a little bit based on the group and how deeply into the game the group is getting. Right? I think we've all played a game where there's just 1 or 2 people that are just taking it way too seriously. And that's no fun because you're like, I'm trying to have fun and you are just ridiculous. So I think that's important too, right? Kind of the nature of the group that you're playing with. Because I've played games of Settlers of Catan where I think people are, they start yelling about, oh, you blocked off where I was going and how dare you put your house there, So
yeah.
I think part of it is too the dynamic of the group of if everybody's willing to keep it at a very casual level. I think a lot of these games could be a great experience for new players or could really suck for new players because they weren't in a great group.
So that was something I was thinking of was, I think a lot of it matters, and all of us, I think, at the table agree, we play games because we enjoy to play games. And there are a lot of people who don't play games because they enjoy it, but because it's something they do. And so I think part of me wouldn't play a complicated game like Power Grid with people just because I would feel like I spent the whole game trying to help other people rather than enjoying playing the game myself. Now that completely depends on the group, and you're right there. So I think that has to figure in there somewhere as well. How much time are you going to spend teaching, and do you enjoy teaching? Because then that might not be a problem for you.
And that might be it. I really enjoy teaching.
Yeah,
what about you, Frank?
I think I enjoy teaching more. So I was on a business trip a couple weeks ago. The people there were 24 people there, and when we started playing games, there were 10 of us roughly who were willing to play. But it must have been either 11 or 9 because it was an odd number when we started. I asked who had played what beyond Monopoly, blah, blah, blah. And a couple of people had played Settlers of Catan. Nobody had heard of Ticket to Ride, which is considered a gateway game. There might have been one person who had played Dominion. So I ended up, Codenames is kind of a rough game to play with an odd number of people. It's you kind of got to have even teams. So I sat back and kind of taught the game and policed the game. In Codenames, one person on each side is giving clues and people have to guess words, but it's easy to guess the other team's words and give them points. The rules say that the code givers they have to say the words that they're giving as clues in a flat tone, no inflection, no other, and there were people like, and you're not even supposed to indicate if they got it right, because if they guessed the wrong word, but it just happened to be still a point for your team, people aren't supposed to know that they're allowed to, you want them to think, the game design is the game wants them to think you got that one right, even though they didn't. And so I was a lot of policing because the code givers were going, yeah, you got that one. And it was like, nope, can't do that. So it really was helpful in that case for me to be outside the game, not one of the players. By the way, when I did get to play, I was awful. They finally told me to shut up and stop offering things because it was always wrong. But everybody was having fun, which is the point. So yeah, I think how much of you're willing to, it does make a difference. If you're willing to coach people a lot, it's one of the reasons why I like Carcassonne as a gateway game. It's fairly quickly in the game, people get it. And if you're not playing that game hyper competitively, because it's got a puzzle aspect to it, you're laying in Carcassonne, you're laying tiles, building cities, fields, roads, and you're scoring points on those. And a thumbnail. Very good. Plays very good at 2 players, plays very good at 5 players. What happens very quickly in that game is the puzzle aspect of how do I match these tiles up so they fit on the board ends up being almost cooperative, where people are like, oh, you can put it here, you can put that tile there, and they won't tell you how to play your scoring piece, but it becomes almost everybody becomes everybody's coach. And that allows you to step into the game again more as a player than as an outside coach. And I think I did get your point, Brent.
That's funny because anytime I've played Carcassonne and I'm pointing out where tiles go, it's not because I want to help the person, it's because they're taking too long and I want them to hurry up. Right? So I'm like, you go here, here, here. You only got 3 options. Pick one. Because they're exploring all these different things. So, but I do agree that Carcassonne, I think, is a good gateway game. I have a friend, Keegan, who absolutely loves that game, and he got the expansion, and for a while he was like, we're playing Carcassonne, and I'd be like, okay, we'll play Carcassonne because I like you and we want to play games. I think one of the big questions too is there's not a lot of times this happens to me, but when you get in a group and say there's 6 people, and 3 of those people are hobby gamers, they play every week, they're into games, they got a collection, and 3 people have never seen any type of Euro-style board game.
Any modern board game.
Any type of modern board game. What game do you bring to the table that everybody's going to be happy with?
6 people?
Okay, 5, 4,
I was
whatever
say
it
6
is.
people.
6 is hard, but
6 is hard.
Let's say 4 or 5.
I would bring a Dominion to the table. I think it's enough different choices to keep the hobby gamers happy, but it's also simple enough because it follows 3 simple rules. You do your actions, you buy your cards, and you clean up. That new gamers can pick that up.
Yeah, so Dominion is a deck building game. You're purchasing cards to build in your deck, ultimately to get the most victory points at the end.
Yeah. So I think I would go, honestly, Carcassonne is a great for that kind of situation. The other one, I've only played it once. Brent, you own it. I was really impressed with King Domino. That game, I went away going, wow, there were enough decisions in that game that that was a very satisfying experience. It was not a long game, and that might be the one drawback is if you're going to be you need a 2-hour activity, you're going to end up playing that about 6 times, and that might get to be a little much because it's kind of a filler. But there were some meaty decisions in it, not huge, but at the same time, it was certainly simple enough that my only concern about would be, I'd be curious as we go further with King Domino to know if that's a game where game experience makes a big difference.
So King Domino, what you do is it's essentially dominoes with tiles. You have a starting player piece, and you get to build a 5x5 square around that with randomly drawn tiles, matching those up by 4 different colors.
Something like that. There's the tiles, instead of having numbers on either side of them, they have kind of landscape, yeah, for lack of a better term. So one will be ocean, one will be fields, one will be forest, and you have to match those up to at least on one square to the squares that are already down for you. And you can't exceed, the hard part is you can't exceed the 5x5.
So we've already talked about filler games though. So
Yeah.
what would separate that from a filler versus a gateway for you? I know those two kind of overlap, but where would we where do we draw that line generally?
So,
Go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Okay,
No, go
so
ahead.
I think that line is actually not about the game. I think it's about your experience as a player. So I think most games that we would call filler games operate really well as gateway games. Now, a lot of them aren't going to teach you all of the mechanics, say as a Tickets to Ride or a Catan will or a Carcassonne will. There's generally not as many decisions to make, which I think can really benefit them as gateway games. But I think as you become more experienced in gaming, those stop necessarily being kind of the simple games that you want to play when you don't want to think and kind of become we got 20 minutes, we got only 30 minutes to play a game. So I think it's really more about the experience of the players than necessarily the game itself.
So the other thing that fillers do that I think are beneficial is fillers have a tendency to have one mechanism, right? So they are really focused on deck building, or they're really focused on negotiation, and it's pretty much that's the entirety of the game. Tile laying. That's pretty much the entirety of the game. That helps in terms of them being gateway games. There aren't a whole lot of fillers that I would say aren't gateway games. In fact, we talked about fillers on a previous episode. We talked about the fact that they tend to be a lower level of complexity. So if you've got a 20 or 30-minute game that's got a lot of meaty decisions, it kind of isn't a filler. Not only is it not maybe a gateway, but it's not a filler.
Yeah, I think about the game Coup, which is kind of an identity game where you're trying to survive to the end and not be found out or assassinated, that kind of thing. Where in our game group, we've played as a filler. We had 30 minutes after dinner that everybody could stick around. But then when I was up at Lake House with all my college friends, we spent a whole night playing it. And that was our game for the night. So I'm not sure our group could play that all night. But in that group, it definitely went from a filler to a gateway because half of the people were gamers and half the people weren't. So a game like that, I think, is really flexible in that sense of, for us, it became kind of the game and that gateway game for a lot of the players there.
So let's close this out with what 3 games would be gateway games for you? Shane?
All right, pick me first, so I just got to go.
Your favorite 3, not just what would be 3. Don't just identify 3. What would be the 3 you would have on your shelf regardless?
So in my mind, I'm thinking, what are 3 games that my wife Jenna is willing to play with me? So if it's a 1-on-1, so 2-player gateway game, I think Star Realms is really good. It's deck building. I think it has some meat to it, but it's not fast paced. You have plenty of time to explain things, and one game really only takes 10-15 minutes. So even if the person has a bad game to start, you're like, oh, that was only 10 minutes. Let's try again. My first experience with Jenna playing that game went that way. So she was like, I don't know that I really understood everything. And then we kept playing it, and she's like, oh, I really like this. And we've tried more complicated versions and the co-op versions and all that kind of thing. So I think Star Realms, Settlers of Catan, I think I took that game home once and got my mom to play it. And she hasn't played it again, but she did admit that it wasn't as bad as she expected, and she did enjoy it.
That's great.
So for me, Settlers of Catan. And then number 3, I'm not sure. I got to think on number 3.
Okay,
what would your 3 be? Yeah, let me think on that.
My number 1 is easily Carcassonne. And the reason is because it's relatively easy to teach. Once people get it, it doesn't take them a whole game to figure out what's going on. And part of it is, you mentioned a 2-player gateway game. In my mind, you can play Carcassonne all the way from 2 players all the way up to the maximum count at 5. It has a very different feel, but nonetheless, it's a good game at all those. Similarly, I would want to look at King Domino because I think that had all the elements of a good gateway game. And again, Brent, you and I played it with just 2 players, and I liked it, but it plays up to 4, and I got a feeling it would be a pretty good game at 4. The last one I would go with would be Ticket to Ride, partly because that's another game that you'll get out there and be amongst people who are not into the hobby, and they may have heard and played it. Maybe not as much as Settlers of Catan, but I've also had a few people who they come out of Settlers of Catan saying their brain hurts. To me, I loved it the first time I played it, It was early in my gaming career, but that's why I would hesitate to put Settlers of Catan is, to my mind, a next step game. Okay, I've gotten you played a couple games, you've enjoyed those. Well, now let's try Settlers of Catan because it's just a tiny bit outside of Gateway, I think, for me. Brent?
So for me, I think Dominion is right up there at the top. I think because depending on what cards you choose to put out, it's almost a different game every time because it's a deck building. There's enough choices out every game, and there's enough players that what's happening in the game changes every time you play it. But it's also simple enough that I think I could put it in front of just about anybody and teach it.
It was almost on my list. Probably would have been if King Domino hadn't crept on.
My second one would be Sushi Go. I think it's a simple enough card game with rules for building, but it also it enforces a pass mechanism and a decision matrix that's a little more complex, but also still a very simple game to play. Last, I would put King Domino on there, even though I don't feel like I have enough experience in it yet to know if it's going to be good long term.
Right. Did you come up with a third, Shane?
Yeah, so I think my last one would probably be Dixit. So Dixit, right, you have a handful of cards that on all of the cards are kind of artwork. One person puts a card out and gives a clue. Everybody else puts a card out that they think everybody's going to guess pertains to that clue. Simply because, the artwork's kind of cool, and every time I played it, people are, looking at the pictures and they're like, this is so weird, but it's kind of cool. So I think just from an aesthetic standpoint, people really enjoy it.
Yeah, I could see that.
And then two, it's such a familiar mechanic with pop culture games like Apples to Apples, or like Cards Against Humanity, those kinds of games that are really kind of familiar in our culture right now. That those mechanics of Dixit, I think, are really familiar to people.
Right. All three of those games, Dixit, Cards Against Humanity, Apples to Apples, they're essentially at their core the same mechanic.
Right.
But they do have very different feels because of the subject matter / I don't know, art.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think Dixit is one that I've brought to the table with people who haven't really played games, and they've ended up really, really enjoying it.
I can see that.
Even if they don't win or aren't even close to winning, like they enjoy the artwork and laughing at people like, you gave that clue, that was such a dumb clue, and everybody laughs, or that was a really good clue, and those kinds of things. So I think for me, Dixit it would be my third.
So I'm going to finish with one more thing, and that is, now everybody listening has a list of, 6 to 9 games that you can run out and buy and learn and have a great experience and get a feel for what we enjoy so much. But if the only thing you have at home is Monopoly, I will say this. If you enforce the auction rule, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, reread the rules, and you quit when the first player is eliminated and just count up the money and see who has the most money and they win, you have a very much something in my mind that feels like a modern game. No elimination. The dice rolling is unusual in a modern game, but the fact is it will play in a reasonable amount of time with no elimination. So try Monopoly with those kinds of things. You two might completely disagree with me, but playing it that way can really make that a much better experience.
Do it.
So that is this episode of the Analog Gamers. We ask you to listen again and spread the word. Over the next week, please tell one person about our podcast and lead them to it.
We'll see you next time.
This has been the Analog Gamers Podcast. You can find us at theanaloggamers.libsyn.com. You can email us at theanaloggamers@gmail.com or find us on Facebook as The Analog Gamers. The Analog Gamers Podcast is licensed under attribution, no commercial, non-derivative, Creative Commons 3.0 license.